So about a decade ago, I was fortunate enough to be involved in a research project that took me from Cape Cod all the way throughout the Canadian Maritimes, going through some incredibly beautiful landscapes. But at the same time, what I was there to uncover, to study, was an invasion that was occurring underfoot throughout this region. I was looking at the European green crab. This is a species that got into New York in around 200 years ago, but mostly was around Cape Cod, New York, maybe Massachusetts for several centuries. Then in the 1980s, populations started to explode. I wanted to figure out why that happened, what had changed in the environment that allowed these species to start taking over new environments and to change them. What were the ecological impacts of the arrival of this green crab, Carcinus manus? When I got to a new area, an area where I'd just gotten, the native crabs there were gone, and the diversity was much lower, so I could immediately tell whether the species was there or not. But as bad as the green crab was for this environment, there are other species, other invasive species that are much worse, that have a much greater impact on the environment. The carnivorous snail from Florida was released throughout the islands of the South Pacific a couple of decades ago. Within about 10 years, 50 species of snails. These are snails that are equivalent to Darwin's finches that had evolved on separate islands. They all went extinct. They were eaten by this one carnivorous snail. The remaining ones in these areas all survive in zoos right now. There are none left except for one species in the wild. So invasive species is an important topic because it's one of the leading causes of biodiversity loss. It also has a major impact on human health. A lot of the diseases that we now struggle with, the infectious diseases, are actually invasive diseases that have come across the oceans, and we're moving them around the world. It also has an economic impact. We spend about $120 billion a year trying to control invasive species, or factoring in the impacts of these species on agriculture, aquaculture, or other marine life as well. So this is what we're up against with invasive species. The results of my work show that not only are we having new invaders spread around the world, but there are also new lineages. Lots of genetic diversity is being transferred around the world in marine systems, largely through ballast water. So we've got these species moving around the world. Once you've got a lot of genetic diversity, it's very likely that they're going to be here to stay. So this is the part of the talk where Jeremy Jackson and Nancy Knowlton would describe as the obituary. This is where it said, well, you think it's bad, it's actually worse, right? Things are looking really bad. So I didn't want to leave it at that. I wanted to find what would be a solution to something like this, to the problem with invasives. As I went around collecting species throughout Europe and also the Maritimes, I found that lots of kids and other people love to collect these crabs with me. In fact, a lot of times I didn't actually have to do any work at all. I just find a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, and they'd go out and collect more of the species than I could possibly need in an hour or two. So they could quickly get to the search image, and it was really fun. So I started to think, well, maybe there's a connection here. Can we get people out there to help us work on this control effort? In addition to being a conservation biologist, I also happen to be a foodie. I'll go, when I travel, miles out of my way to try and find a local meal, something that's specific to that region. And while I was working collecting crabs in Nova Scotia, I thought, these crabs actually are eaten in Europe, and they're considered delicacy, especially in Italy and other places. So could we collect them here and start serving them, start eating them ourselves in this region? As it turned out, I collected some green crabs, fried them up using Yule Gibbons as a guide. His Stalking the Blue-Eyed Scallop was my guidebook early on. Found that not only were these green crab's delicious, but there were other species, other invasive species like periwinkles that could also be served up. So I started to think, okay, here's a way that we might be able to use these invaders in actually an unsustainable way, ideally. We're not trying to be sustainable here. Unlike in fisheries, where you're always struggling to control your appetite, here what you want to do is eat or capture as many of them as possible. So in 2004, I wrote an article for Audubon magazine. What I did was I interviewed chefs from around the country, including Jacques Pepin, who offered a recipe for periwinkles. Alice Waters gave me a recipe for stinging nettles. The fabulous restaurant Préjean's in Louisiana gave me a recipe that included 2 invaders, nutria, as well as wild boar. So here we were starting to develop a host of recipes for lots of species that could basically, rather than having to go travel around the world to look for these good meals, you could actually make them at home from species that were collected right in your backyard. It's not only animals that are invasive, of course, weeds. There are lots of exotic, non-native weeds. This is garlic mustard, very invasive on the East Coast. I think it's arrived in Seattle about 10 years ago in 1999. It's a very good competitor. It competes against other flowers, but it also puts out toxins that can kill soil fungi. So when you look at the forest floors in Connecticut, all you see is garlic mustard because it's killing the fungi that support the saplings, the young trees in that region. So incredibly damaging pest. What can we do about that? Well, we can harvest it and make it into pesto. At least that's one recipe that you can do with this species. You don't have to go out, you don't have to necessarily use pesticides, but actually just a little bit of labor, and then you actually get quite a delicious meal out of that at the end of your work. The northern crayfish was introduced to Arizona in the 1960s as food for sport fish. Unfortunately, the sport fish didn't really eat it, and the crayfish took off. They started eating native plants, then they started eating native animals, and now they're even starting to cannibalize each other. They're so common in these regions. So what did the Arizona Game and Fish Department propose? To take on what the Cajuns do, right? Millions of Cajuns can't be wrong. Why not make crawfish etouffee or other crawfish recipes? They encourage people to go out there with nets or just by hand, collect these. Make sure, and this is important when you're doing this, not to transfer these things alive, because that's one of the risks of eating invasives, is encouraging people to move them around. You have to make sure you consume them and you're not transferring them between different waterways. They admit it, and this is true for me as well, that this is, I'm serious about this, that it can be helpful, but in a large part it's about outreach. It's about teaching people about invasive species, to start thinking about what's invasive and what's not, and get people outside again, to enjoy this, to learn about conservation in a new way that's not all about obituaries. There are some species, however, that are going to be more challenging than others. These are zebra mussels up here, tiny, not a lot of meat, and they also tend to be in waterways that aren't very clear, very clean, so I wouldn't encourage eating them. And I would have thought the same for Hemigrapsis sanguineus. This is an Asian shore crab that just got to the East Coast in the 1980s. I thought, well, they're too small, no one's going to want to eat them. But then I went to a restaurant in New Haven called Mia's Sushi, and this is a picture of Bun Lai, who is one of my culinary heroes. He has a sushi bar in New Haven where he only eats sustainable wildlife and focuses on invasive species. There's no shrimp on the menu, there's no tuna on the menu, but there are that small, tiny Hemigrapsis, which he has ground up basically to make into a paste, and the product is quite delicious. He also puts them out, he will deep fry the crabs and put them out on a slate that resembles, he says, the Connecticut coast. So Bun Lai can show that you can have recipes or you can have restaurants that are not only sustainable, but can also promote ecological awareness. And what's amazing about this restaurant as well is when I first got there, he has about a 52-page menu. There are a lot of invaders out there. What I found was that half of that menu is actually imaginary. It's things that he's dreaming up. He's never actually made them. So you have to figure out which ones are the ones that are going to be invasive, which ones you can order that particular day, and which ones you can't. Highly recommend it if you get there. We started a website about 6 months ago called Eat the Invaders. Collecting all of these recipes, trying to think of ways that we can get people from the public to bring their own recipes in there and look at it across the U.S. So it's not only it's regional, but we're also looking at species from throughout the world, how they got here. You'll see a picture of George Washington here. My colleague Deborah Greger discovered that the cookbook that was put together by Martha Washington when she was married to George had about half of the species there were current invasive species. What it was she had been married twice, and the cookbook had come over from England from her ancestors, so it was all British species. Once they brought the book here, these were invasive species that could be prepared right here locally. So we propose that George and Martha might have been the country's first invasivores. So keep in mind, though, that as important I think that eating invasive species can be, it's much more important to stop species before they get here. That is the biggest take-home message is prevention. Because once they get here, it's very hard to get rid of them. By eating them, we might be able to reduce their ecological impact, but we're probably not going to make them completely disappear. Ways to do that include ballast water controls, trying to reduce the amount of water that's moved between harbors, as well as not allowing new species to come into an area unless they're proven to be non-invasive. That's the other way that's the opposite way that we usually look at it. The burden of proof should be on the people that are bringing these species into the area. Interestingly, Idaho is one of the first states to pass this law. Rapid response and monitoring is also important. When a species gets in, you have to find it, and two, you want to respond quickly to eradicate it before the range expands, and it's really going to be very difficult to control them at that point. And then finally, awareness. And this is where eating invasives comes in. Outreach to the general public, telling them about the problems, how they might transmit invasive species, and also through blogs and books about eating invasive species, collecting invasive species, or really just going out and monitoring. There are lots of citizen networks that look at invasives. One of the advantages of that, of course, is they're incredibly common. They're easy to find, so most people can learn how to do this pretty quickly. But a lot of it is just to have fun with it, right? Here's an exception to every lesson we learn in conservation biology, which is you want to learn how to control consumption. In this case, you want to eat these as much as you can. There are lots of great options here. Here's a 3-course meal that I propose: periwinkles, nutria, and kudzu sorbet. Dandelion wine on the sign. All of these have been prepared, by the way. And as my colleague Bill Walton said, in this case, it's one of the few cases where you don't have to worry. Extinction actually is a happy ending. And I want to thank my colleagues who've helped develop this project along with me. And thank you.